Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following content is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the official courtroom testimony of the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs as reported by Inner City Press. No one in the packed courtroom was prepared for what happened next. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom opened with a creak that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the tense silence. Every head turned, whispers ignited like sparks as Chris Brown stepped through the threshold. He wasn't on the witness list for that day. No one had been expecting him. But there he stood, shoulders squared, face unreadable, carrying himself with the deliberate composure of a man who had finally made a decision he'd been avoiding for over a decade. The prosecution had filed an emergency motion just hours earlier, requesting permission to call an additional witness whose testimony had become crucial to establishing the full scope of the defendant's criminal enterprise. The judge had granted the motion with obvious curiosity, but even she couldn't have anticipated the seismic shift that was about to occur in her courtroom. Chris Brown wore a simple charcoal suit, no jewelry, no designer accessories, none of the flash that had defined his public image for years. As he walked down the center aisle, each step seemed to echo with the weight of secrets he had carried in silence of trauma. He had transformed into tabloid headlines of a truth he was finally ready to speak. Sean Diddy Combs, seated at the defense table, didn't visibly flinch when he saw Brown enter. But those who knew how to read micro-expressions caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition and something deeper, something that looked like dread. When Chris reached the witness stand and placed his hand on the Bible, his voice didn't waver. It cut through the courtroom's silence like a blade through silk. "I wasn't planning to be here today," he began, his Virginia accent carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward. "For years, I told myself that silence would protect me, that survival meant playing the game by his rules. But I'm done playing games. I'm done protecting anyone but the truth." Chris Brown's testimony began not with dramatic revelations, but with a methodical reconstruction of how a talented teenager from Tappahannock, Virginia, had become a target for one of the music industry's most sophisticated predators. "I was 17 when I first met Sean Combs," Chris testified, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of regret that seemed to age him in real time. "Just a kid with a voice and a dream fresh off my first album going platinum. I thought I had made it, but I was about to learn that in this industry, success just makes you a more valuable commodity." Chris described the meeting with the clinical precision of someone who had replayed the moment countless times in therapy sessions and sleepless nights. It was at an industry party in 2006, one of those exclusive gatherings where everyone who matters shows up to see and be seen. Sean approached me personally, said he'd been watching my career, that I reminded him of a younger version of himself. The flattery had been intoxicating for a teenager who had grown up without much male guidance. He positioned himself as more than just another industry executive. He was offering mentorship wisdom, a roadmap to the kind of longevity that most artists never achieve. For a 17-year-old kid from Virginia, that attention felt like validation from God himself. But Chris's testimony revealed that even in those early interactions, Diddy was conducting a careful assessment of his vulnerabilities and boundaries. Every conversation felt like an interview, but not for a job, for something else. He'd ask about my family, my upbringing, my relationships. He wanted to know what made me tick, what I was afraid of, what I wanted most in the world. The grooming process was gradual and sophisticated. It started with invitations to private dinners, exclusive studio sessions, industry events where I was often the youngest person in the room. Sean would introduce me to people I'd only seen in magazines, make me feel like I was being inducted into some secret society of success. Chris described how Diddy used his knowledge of the teenager's background to deepen their connection. He knew I'd grown up without my father being consistently present, that I was hungry for that kind of male approval and guidance. He exploited that need, masterfully positioning himself as the father figure I'd been missing. The manipulation was subtle, but effective. He'd share stories about his own rise to power, the sacrifices he'd made, the loyalty he expected from his inner circle. He made me feel like being chosen by Sean Combs was the greatest honor an artist could receive. As Chris Brown's testimony continued, he described how Diddy's mentorship evolved from professional guidance into something far more personal and ultimately predatory. By 2007, Sean had convinced me that I needed what he called private education intensive sessions, where he would teach me the real rules of the industry. Chris testified, his voice growing quieter as he approached the most difficult part of his story. He said that what they teach you in the mainstream music business is just the surface level that real power required, understanding deeper truths. These sessions took place at various private locations, Diddy's homes in different cities, rented estates, exclusive retreats. The locations were always isolated, always secure, always designed to make you feel like you were entering a different world where normal rules didn't apply. Chris described the psychological conditioning that preceded the physical abuse. Sean would talk about power dynamics, about submission and dominance, about how success in the entertainment industry required a willingness to do whatever was necessary to please those who controlled your fate. The sessions involved increasingly inappropriate exercises disguised as industry training. He'd have me perform various scenarios, acting out different personas, exploring what he called emotional range, pushing boundaries that I didn't even understand were boundaries at the time. Diddy used Chris's career ambitions as leverage for compliance. He would remind me constantly of the opportunities he was providing, the doors he was opening, the career trajectory he was orchestrating. The implication was always clear: my cooperation in these sessions was directly connected to my professional success. The most disturbing aspect of these education sessions was how they were framed as normal industry practice. Sean would tell me that all successful artists had gone through similar experiences, that this was just part of paying dues in the entertainment business. He made me believe that resistance showed weakness, that compliance showed professionalism. Chris's voice cracked slightly as he described the escalation. What started as psychological manipulation gradually became physical. The touching, the inappropriate contact, the situations where consent wasn't requested, it was just expected. And I was too young, too naive, too desperate for success to understand that what was happening wasn't mentorship. It was abuse. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Chris Brown prepared to describe what he characterized as the night that changed everything, a private party in 2009 that would haunt him for years to come. It was supposed to be a celebration. Chris testified, his voice barely above a whisper. Sean had just closed some major business deal, and he was hosting what he called an intimate gathering for his closest associates and protégés. I was told it was an honor to be invited, that this was where real industry business got done. The party took place at one of Diddy's properties in the Hollywood Hills, a mansion that Chris described as designed for secrecy. No phones were allowed inside, no unauthorized personnel, no way to document what happened behind those walls. Sean said it was about creating a safe space for powerful people to be themselves without worrying about public scrutiny. What Chris witnessed that night would shatter his understanding of the industry he thought he knew. There were rooms in that mansion that guests weren't supposed to enter, areas that were clearly off limits to most of the attendees. But Sean took me on what he called a private tour, showing me parts of his world that he said were reserved for his most trusted inner circle. The tour revealed a systematic operation that went far beyond typical entertainment industry excess. I saw young women who looked scared, who seemed to be there against their will. I saw men in positions of power taking advantage of people who were clearly vulnerable. And I saw Sean orchestrating all of it like he was conducting a symphony of exploitation. Chris described witnessing what he believed was sexual assault occurring in a private room. A young woman was clearly saying no, clearly trying to leave, but she was being restrained by security personnel, while older men took turns with her. When I tried to intervene, Sean's people physically stopped me. The teenager's reaction was immediate and visceral. I started yelling, demanding that they let her go, threatening to call the police. But Sean just laughed and said I was being naive, that this was just how the industry worked, that powerful men had certain privileges that came with their success. The aftermath of Chris's outburst would define his relationship with Diddy for years to come. Sean made it clear that my reaction was problematic, that my emotional instability made me a liability. He said that if I ever spoke about what I had witnessed, no one would believe me because of my age and inexperience. But instead of being intimidated, Chris was galvanized. That night I realized that everything I thought I knew about Sean Combs was a lie. He wasn't a mentor or a father figure. He was a predator who used his power to exploit vulnerable people. And I was just another one of his victims. Following the 2009 incident, Chris Brown's relationship with Diddy evolved into what he described as psychological warfare, disguised as continued mentorship. After that night, Sean couldn't control me through manipulation anymore. Chris testified, his voice growing stronger as he described his resistance. So he switched tactics. Instead of trying to make me compliant, he focused on making me controllable through chaos and public destruction. Chris described how Diddy began systematically undermining his career and personal life. Suddenly, projects I was supposed to be involved in would fall through without explanation. Collaborations with other artists would mysteriously get canceled. Radio stations would stop playing my music as heavily. The sabotage was subtle, but effective. It was never anything that could be directly traced back to Sean, but the pattern was undeniable. Every time I tried to distance myself from his influence, something would go wrong in my professional life. But the most insidious aspect of Diddy's retaliation was psychological. He would call me at my lowest points after a public controversy, after a career setback, after a personal crisis. He'd position himself as the only person who still believed in me, the only one who could help me rebuild. Chris testified about how these conversations followed a predictable pattern. He would start with sympathy and support, making me feel like he was the only person who understood what I was going through. Then he would gradually shift to criticism and control, pointing out all the ways I had failed and all the reasons I needed his guidance. The manipulation was designed to create dependency. Sean wanted me to believe that my career success was entirely dependent on his approval, that my public image was something he could make or break at will. And for a while, I believed him. Chris described how this psychological abuse manifested in his public behavior. The erratic outbursts, the conflicts with authority, the self-destructive patterns, a lot of that was me trying to regain some sense of control over my life after having it systematically stripped away. The most damaging aspect was how Diddy used Chris's public struggles to reinforce his control. Every time I would act out publicly, Sean would use it as evidence that I was unstable, that I needed his guidance to function in the industry. He turned my trauma responses into proof of his own necessity. In a revelation that surprised even the prosecution, Chris Brown testified about his decision to secretly document his interactions with Diddy, a project that would ultimately provide crucial evidence for the federal case. Around 2015, I realized that my word alone would never be enough to expose what Sean was doing. Chris testified, pulling out a leather portfolio that had been submitted as evidence. So I started keeping records, not just of our direct interactions, but of the entire network of control and manipulation he had built around me. Chris described developing a sophisticated system for preserving evidence. I would record phone calls when legally possible, screenshot text messages, document incidents with dates and witnesses. I treated it like building a case because I knew that someday someone would need proof of what had happened. The documentation revealed the scope of Diddy's influence network. It wasn't just Sean himself, it was a whole ecosystem of people who helped maintain his control. Managers, agents, label executives, media contacts, all working together to keep his victims in line. Chris's evidence included recorded conversations where Diddy explicitly discussed his methods for controlling artists. I have hours of audio where Sean talks about breaking down artists' resistance, about using their vulnerabilities against them, about the importance of maintaining fear and dependency. The most damaging evidence was a series of text messages that revealed Diddy's direct involvement in sabotaging Chris's career. Whenever something went wrong professionally, I would get messages from Sean that were too perfectly timed to be coincidental. He would offer sympathy while subtly taking credit for having the power to make things better. One particularly incriminating exchange occurred after Chris lost a major endorsement deal. Sean texted me saying, "Tough break with the sponsor situation. Maybe it's time we talked about getting you back on track." When I didn't respond immediately, he followed up with, "You know I'm the only one who can really help you, right? Chris testified about the psychological toll of maintaining this secret documentation project. Living with this evidence, constantly recording my own trauma, it was like carrying poison. But I knew that someday this information could be the key to stopping Sean and protecting other victims. Chris Brown's testimony took a deeply personal turn as he described how Diddy weaponized mental health stigma to discredit his potential accusations and maintain control over his narrative. One of Sean's most effective tactics was convincing everyone, including me, that my reactions to his abuse were evidence of mental instability. Chris testified, his voice heavy with the weight of years of gaslighting. Every time I would try to speak out about what he had done, he would frame it as a mental health episode. Chris described how this manipulation worked on multiple levels. Publicly, Sean would express concern about my well-being, positioning himself as someone who cared about my mental health. Privately, he would use my struggles as leverage, reminding me that no one would believe someone with my history of erratic behavior. The strategy was particularly effective because it contained elements of truth. I was struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD from the abuse, real mental health issues that needed real treatment. But Sean twisted those struggles into weapons against me. Chris testified about how Diddy would deliberately trigger his trauma responses, then use those reactions as evidence of instability. He would bring up painful memories, create stressful situations, push my buttons until I would break down or lash out. Then he would point to my reaction as proof that I couldn't be trusted with the truth. The manipulation extended to Chris's professional relationships. Sean would have conversations with my management team, my label executives, even my family members expressing concern about my mental state. He positioned himself as the responsible adult trying to help a troubled young man. This strategy served multiple purposes. It made me doubt my own perceptions and memories. It gave Sean cover for his abuse by framing me as an unreliable narrator, and it isolated me from potential support systems who had been convinced I was unstable. Chris described the devastating impact of this psychological warfare. I started questioning everything: my memories of what had happened, my reactions to ongoing abuse, even my right to speak out about what I had experienced. Sean had convinced me that my trauma was actually mental illness. The breakthrough came through therapy with professionals who specialized in abuse recovery. I had to learn to separate my legitimate mental health struggles from the gaslighting I had experienced. The trauma was real, but it wasn't evidence of instability. It was evidence of abuse. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted dramatically when Chris Brown revealed the existence of a recorded voicemail from Diddy that would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. In 2017, after I had started distancing myself from Sean's influence, I received a voicemail that I knew I had to preserve. Chris testified, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to share evidence he had kept secret for years. With the judge's permission, the prosecution played the voicemail for the courtroom. Diddy's voice filled the space, smooth, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable undertone of menace. "Chris, it's Sean. I've been hearing some concerning things about your attitude lately. You know I've always looked out for you, always had your back when things got difficult. But loyalty is a two-way street, little brother. You remember where you came from, who opened those doors for you. This industry has a long memory, and so do I. Some bridges, once you burn them, you can never rebuild. Think carefully about the choices you're making. Call me back. We need to talk." The silence that followed the playback was deafening. Even seasoned court reporters seemed to pause in their transcription, processing the implications of what they had just heard. That voicemail wasn't a friendly check-in. Chris testified, his voice cutting through the silence. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of mentorship. Sean was reminding me that he had power over my career, that speaking out against him would have consequences. Chris described the psychological impact of receiving that message. I listened to it dozens of times, trying to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe Sean really was just concerned about me. But every time I heard it, the threat became clearer. The voicemail represented a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond Chris's individual case. This wasn't just about controlling me. It was about maintaining a system where victims stayed silent out of fear, where speaking truth to power was treated as betrayal. Chris testified about his decision to preserve the recording. "I knew that someday someone would need proof of how Sean operated, how he used intimidation disguised as concern to maintain control over his victims." This voicemail was evidence of his true character. The prosecution used the recording to establish Diddy's pattern of threatening behavior toward potential witnesses. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic effort to silence anyone who might expose his criminal activities. Chris Brown's testimony expanded beyond his personal experience to reveal how Diddy's abuse had created ripple effects throughout the entertainment industry, affecting not just direct victims, but entire networks of artists, executives, and industry professionals. What people don't understand is that Sean's influence extended far beyond his direct victims. Chris testified, his voice carrying the weight of years of observation and analysis. He created a culture of fear and complicity that infected the entire industry. Chris described witnessing other young artists go through similar experiences. "I would see new faces at Sean's events, young singers and rappers who had that same hungry look I'd had when I first met him, and I would watch them gradually change, becoming more guarded, more fearful, more dependent on his approval." The systematic nature of the abuse became clear through Chris's testimony. It wasn't random predatory behavior. It was an organized operation designed to identify, groom, and exploit vulnerable young talent. Sean had refined his methods over decades of practice. Chris testified about his attempts to warn other potential victims. "I tried to reach out to some of the younger artists I saw entering Sean's orbit, but it was difficult because I couldn't speak directly about what had happened without risking retaliation." The code of silence was maintained through a combination of fear and complicity. Everyone in the industry knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to speak out. There was too much money involved, too many careers at stake, too much power protecting the system. Chris described how the abuse affected not just the direct victims, but their families, friends, and professional relationships. The trauma doesn't stay contained. It spreads to everyone who cares about the victim. My family, my friends, my romantic partners, they all suffered because of what Sean did to me. The most devastating aspect was how the industry's response to victims often compounded their trauma. Instead of investigating or offering support, the industry would typically engage in damage control, protecting the abuser's reputation while isolating the victim. Chris's testimony revealed how this system of abuse and silence had persisted for decades because it was financially profitable for everyone involved, except the victims. As long as Sean continued to generate revenue for labels, media companies, and other industry players, there was no incentive to investigate or stop his criminal behavior. As Chris Brown's testimony neared its conclusion, he addressed the personal and professional costs of his decision to come forward, as well as his hopes for systemic change in the entertainment industry. "I know that testifying here today will probably end what's left of my relationship with certain parts of the music industry." Chris said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was risking. "But I've realized that staying silent to protect my career means enabling Sean to continue destroying other people's lives." Chris spoke directly to other potential victims who might be watching or reading about his testimony. "If you're out there carrying secrets like I was, know that you're not alone. Know that the shame and fear you're feeling doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who hurt you." He addressed the broader implications of his decision to speak out. This case isn't just about Sean Combs, or even about the music industry. It's about power structures that protect predators and silence victims across all sectors of society. Chris's testimony included a direct challenge to industry leaders and media outlets. Everyone who knew or suspected what was happening and chose to stay silent bears some responsibility for the continued abuse. Neutrality in the face of evil is complicity. But his most powerful words were directed at Diddy himself. Looking directly at the defendant, Chris delivered his final statement with quiet intensity. "You told me that speaking out would destroy my career, that no one would believe me, that I would regret crossing you. But the only thing I regret is waiting so long to tell the truth." Chris's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You built your empire on the broken dreams and stolen innocence of young artists who trusted you. You used our hunger for success as a weapon against us, turning our dreams into chains. But empires built on exploitation always fall. and yours is falling now. The final moments of Chris's testimony were delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found peace through truth-telling. I survived you, Sean. Not just the abuse, but the years of manipulation, gaslighting, and intimidation that followed. And by surviving, by speaking out, by refusing to be silenced, I've taken back the power you stole from me. As Chris stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained in stunned silence. His testimony had been more than just evidence in a criminal case. It had been a masterclass in courage, a demonstration of what healing looks like when victims reclaim their voices and their power. The entertainment industry would spend years processing the implications of what Chris Brown had revealed. But one thing was immediately clear. The culture of silence that had protected predators for decades was finally beginning to crack under the weight of truth. Outside the courthouse, Chris faced a crowd of supporters, reporters, and cameras. His statement was brief but powerful. Today, I stopped being a victim and became a survivor. Tomorrow, I'll use my voice to make sure no other young artist has to endure what I endured. The boy from Virginia, who had once dreamed of musical stardom, had just delivered the performance of his lifetime, not on stage, but in a federal courtroom, speaking truth to power, and finally breaking free from the chains of his own silence.